When we revisit the opening lines of Genesis chapter 6, or the early chapters of the Book of Enoch, an unsettling image begins to emerge. The angels, known as the Watchers, beheld the daughters of men, they desired them, and they fell. They no longer remained in their appointed places. They abandoned their heavenly realm, entered the world of men, took wives, and bore children. These children, the Nephilim, were half-human, half-divine beings who spread chaos across the earth. It's a well-known story, retold countless times, explored in numerous videos, sermons, and studies. Yet beneath the thick layers of awe and fear lies a profound question that has rarely, if ever, been asked. If all the Watchers fell, who remained to guard the covenant? Who stayed to uphold the divine order in a world descending into chaos? If every angel betrayed their purpose, what preserved Noah, a righteous man in his generation? What made his family, amid a sea of hybrid bloodlines and violence, still be called pure, still be chosen to serve as the bridge between the world before and after the great flood? If all the heavenly host turned away, then who came to warn Noah? Who preserved life as the world stood on the brink of obliteration? These questions are not posed to discredit the Book of Enoch or the Scriptures, but to deepen our grasp of the sacred. For if we only see the fall, we may overlook those who stood firm. If we only focus on what was corrupted, we may miss what was preserved. And the answer to these questions cannot be found in Enoch, nor in most modern versions of the Bible. It lies hidden in a text long removed from the canon, a book labeled as apocryphal, pushed to the margins, yet safeguarded within the Ethiopian tradition for millennia. A book called Jubilees. And from this book, the whispered remnants of the heavenly realm begins to speak again, not to tell a new story, but to complete the part of the old story that was left untold, not to replace Scripture, but to help us reread familiar lines with eyes that have never truly been opened. Among the many ancient writings penned in the first era of faith, there exists a book rarely copied, never read aloud in grand churches, absent from popular Bibles, yet curiously preserved in the land of Ethiopia. That book is Jubilees. Cast out from the official canon early on, Jubilees continued to circulate among communities that never strayed from the rhythm of the sacred. Unlike the Book of Enoch, which focuses intensely on the fall of the Watchers and the tragic consequences of their interference, Jubilees emerges as a quiet yet piercing testimony, reminding us that not all fell. Within the oft-forgotten pages of Jubilees, there are angels who did not fall. There were those who kept the positions heaven had entrusted to them. Uriel, unlike the Watchers, did not leave his place to indulge desire. He was sent to warn Noah, to protect the seed of life before the great flood. Raphael, the angel of healing, was commanded to bind Azazel, one of the earliest rebels, and cast him into the abyss. Michael, the archangel, was appointed to safeguard the righteous lineage from Abraham, never abandoning his divine post. These angels did not perform grand acts, did not appear with thunder or great visions, but they did something greater. They stood firm. They did not fall. They held their place. The story of the Watchers, then, is not only one of darkness. If the Book of Enoch echoes the sound of betrayal, then Jubilees preserves the voice of faithfulness. If Enoch is an indictment, then Jubilees is a reminder. If Enoch tells us what went wrong, then Jubilees gently whispers what still remained right, even though no one speaks of it anymore. And perhaps it is that righteousness which modern theological history has deliberately overlooked. Truth is not always erased. Sometimes it is simply relocated to a place harder to find. And maybe the rejected book is the very place where faithfulness is still written down, not to refute, but to complete, not to argue, but to remind, that when the darkness thickens, there are still stars that do not fade, that when angels fall, there are still those who do not forget their vows. And if we pause to listen, we may hear their voices echoing from the very pages that have been forgotten. While the Book of Enoch devotes nearly all its attention to recounting the fall of the Watchers, those angels who left their places, crossed divine boundaries, and caused immense destruction, the Book of Jubilees quietly speaks of another reality, that some angels did not fall. Though not dazzling, though not accompanied by thunder or great miracles, they remained, steadfast in their assigned roles, like silent pillars holding the dome of the cosmos from collapse. Uriel was one of them. Not a fallen angel, he was sent from heaven to warn Noah before the flood, to deliver instructions, not because Noah was exceptional, but because he still walked in rhythm with the covenant. Raphael, another angel, not only refused to betray heaven, but was directly sent to bind Azazel, one of the leaders of the rebellion. While Azazel spread corrupt knowledge and shattered divine order, Raphael acted under divine command, imprisoning him in a deep abyss where light cannot reach. Michael, the archangel, is mentioned in Jubilees as the protector of Abraham, not just in battles, but through the turning points of faith. He guarded the righteous line, not with sword and shield, but with timely, silent presence. These details, based only on modern Bibles, are nearly impossible to uncover. So the question arises, why were these passages omitted? Why is the role of the faithful angels either ignored or blurred within the framework of the official canon? Could it be that if these steadfast angels were fully acknowledged, readers would begin to question the entire theological narrative? Could it be that when we realize not all fell, we must re-examine the idea of total fall and everything that followed? A theological system that seeks to maintain simplicity often resists details that complicate it. But in the spiritual reality, it is precisely those complexities that fully reflect the workings of heaven, earth, and mankind. And Jubilees, in its quiet neglect, is the very place that records these rays of light, not to contradict other texts, but to fill in what has been left out. Like a night watchman, unnamed and unseen, keeping the lamp burning until the dawn comes. In the early centuries of the Christian faith, before the Church had clearly defined its doctrines and canon, there was one surprising truth. The Church Fathers, the theological pillars of the early age, frequently cited the Book of Enoch. Tertullian, a prominent second-century theologian, not only referenced Enoch with reverence, but also believed its contents aligned with divine revelation. Origen, one of the first minds to systematize theology, also referred to Enoch on multiple occasions, particularly when explaining the hierarchy of the heavenly realms. Clement of Alexandria, who harmonized Greek knowledge with Jewish revelation, once considered Enoch an essential part of ancient wisdom. To them, Enoch was not a strange book, but a clear testimony of a deep spiritual dimension, where angels actively participated in human history. Yet by the 4th century, a wave of change began. The Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, and the Council of Constantinople, 381 AD, marked a turning point in the formalization of scripture and doctrine. From a tradition that was once diverse and expansive, the Church began to narrow the scope of belief for the purpose of doctrinal unity and consolidation of authority. Anything that did not meet the criteria for standardization was labeled pagan or dangerous. Among those rejected were the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and a significant portion of Ethiopian texts. Not because they were forgeries, but because they raised too many theological questions the emerging system was not prepared to confront. Enoch does not merely tell the tale of the fallen watchers. It presents a world where angels possess free will and can err. A world where divine order is not static, but dynamic. A world where light and darkness are not completely separate, but intersect at the threshold of testing. Thus, Enoch, along with Jubilees, is not easy to systematize. It cannot be reduced to a few creeds. It cannot be taught in short catechisms. These texts require the reader to listen, not only with intellect, but with spiritual intuition. Perhaps this is why they were considered dangerous. Not because they contradicted truth, but because they opened a dimension of truth that later generations were not yet ready to face. A dimension where angels are not all the same, where there is falling, but also standing, where the covenant is not broken, but buried, and when future generations chose simplicity for the sake of control. Testimonies like Enoch and Jubilees had to be temporarily hidden. But sacred words, once written, are not easily silenced. They simply wait for those with ears to hear, and for the time to return. As Western theology entered the age of systematization, a clear trend emerged: to simplify the spiritual world for easier teaching, dissemination, and control. God was presented as an omnipotent, absolute being, unchanging, operating on a linear timeline. The Bible became a unified, closed block, with no room for questioning or expansion. Angels, once described in various ranks and roles, were gradually reduced to simplistic figures of service or message-bearing. In this process, something vital was sacrificed: the sacred complexity and profound depth of the metaphysical world as once depicted in ancient texts. The Book of Jubilees, like many other banned writings, does not conform to that simplified model. It describes a reality where there is a heavenly council, where angels are not equals but have distinct roles: guardian angels, recording angels, judging angels, celestial astronomers. They do not act independently, but in accordance with sacred cycles, holy calendars, and time frames established since creation. And within this world, there are angels who fall, but also those who never abandon their place. There is apostasy, but also preservation. There is darkness, but also light that has never gone out. Modern theology, in its effort to maintain order, has removed much of that complexity, not because it is false, but because it is hard to manage. It's easier to present a spiritual universe with only two sides, God and evil. But Jubilees whispers that between light and darkness, there are gray zones, liminal spaces where choices are made and silent faithfulness remains. It's more comfortable to claim that God controls all things directly, but Jubilees reminds us he works through layers of intermediaries, through laws given at the beginning, through a calendar written before humanity ever fell. And perhaps it is exactly because of this richness that Jubilees and similar texts were hidden. not to be forgotten, but to prevent confusion in an age that demanded simplicity. But if we cannot face the spiritual reality in its fullness, are we not forfeiting a greater part of truth? Could it be that what confuses us at first may be what matures us in the end? Could it be that in that sacred complexity we may rediscover the depth we've lost and the connection between heaven, earth, and man that existed from the beginning? In most modern sermons, Eden is often portrayed as the starting point of sin, the place where humanity first disobeyed and was expelled from God's presence. But the Book of Jubilees tells a different story, a deeper layer of meaning, where Eden is not merely a memory of the fall, but a testimony of a primordial covenant. Before Adam was expelled from the garden, he lived there for 7 years, not by random time, but according to a sacred calendar, synchronized with the cycle God had established. In those 7 years, Adam observed the Sabbath. He didn't just reside, he lived in tune with a divine rhythm. Jubilees emphasizes that from the very beginning, righteous living was not just moral goodness, but alignment with a sacred frequency. The covenant did not begin at Sinai, it existed in Eden. Adam was not merely asked to believe, but to keep the holy day of rest, to observe ritual order, to live in harmony between heaven and earth. And when Adam fell out of that rhythm, it wasn't simply sin, he fell out of the garden. Eden, through the lens of Jubilees, is not a simple moral tale of right and wrong, but a theological blueprint. Those who maintain the rhythm remain. Those who fall out of sync are cast from the cycle of life. It is fascinating to realize that being cast out of the garden, commonly seen as the first consequence of sin, is described as the result of falling out of ritual rhythm. Not merely eating forbidden fruit, but losing the cycle. Not merely disobeying a command, but going out of sync with an invisible music set on the 4th day, when the sun, moon, and stars were appointed to mark days, seasons, and years. And Adam, for those first 7 years, lived in harmony with that music before falling out of tune. Jubilees does not portray Eden as mythological land. It presents Eden as a model, a living symbol for every generation. That the covenant is not just a law written on stone tablets, but an inner rhythm of life. That sacred loss does not arrive suddenly, but when we go off-beat. And for that reason, Eden, in the memory of Jubilees, is not the origin of sin, but the first testimony of a divine law that existed even before the Bible was formed. A law that does not demand punishment, but harmony, not imposition, but invitation. And if the fall began in Eden, then perhaps restoration must begin by returning to that original rhythm. When we speak of law in Scripture, most modern readers assume it all began at Sinai, where Moses received stone tablets from God amidst thunder and cloud. But Jubilees, with its ancient voice and distinct theological structure, paints a completely different timeline. According to it, the law was not a historical event, but a sacred cycle, existing since creation, preserved by a hidden lineage, not needing tablets, priests, or temple rites. They lived in that rhythm, like fish in water, like seasons in the year, not out of compulsion, but because it was formed within them. After Adam, Jubilees lists an astonishing succession of those who kept the law, not with words, but with rhythm. Seth, Enoch, Noah, Shem, and then Abraham. None of them lived after Sinai. None received divinely written commandments. Yet all offered sacrifices, kept the Sabbath, lived according to sacred seasons. Enoch recorded the cycles of the heavens. Noah made offerings at the appointed time after the flood. Shem preserved the righteous line through the chaos of Babel. And Abraham, the patriarch of three great religions according to Jubilees, kept all commandments, laws, and ordinances, even before there was an Israel, before Moses, before any formal law. If true, this not only expands our perspective, but reverses part of modern theological models. If law did not begin with Moses, then grace is not a replacement for law, but a call back to the original rhythm. If the patriarchs lived by the law before it was officially given, then the law is not just regulation, it is the expression of harmony between God and humanity, between earth and heaven, between time and soul. Jubilees does not portray the law as a burden, but as a melody, an ancient song that only those who live slowly, rightly, and with remembrance can hear. And in a world full of noise, chaos, and disorientation, this silent melody of the ancestors rings like a bell, that maybe we do not need to invent anything new, but simply rediscover what has been forgotten. Law, as it turns out, is not the rigid image we've long imagined. It is a whisper from the beginning of creation, a spiritual map etched into time itself, waiting only for us to return to the right season, the right rhythm, the right step. The Book of Jubilees does not merely recount sacred historical events, it draws a map of time, a sacred calendar, so intricate and profound that if thrown off, the spiritual world itself could fracture. According to Jubilees, a year does not consist of 365 days as we know it, but 364 divided into a perfect 52 weeks, with each season having exactly 91 days and every year beginning on a Wednesday. The very day in Genesis when God created the sun, moon, and stars to mark days, seasons, and years. This is no arbitrary detail. It is the foundation of the entire rhythm of right living, a synchronization between cosmic time and human life, between physical light and spiritual light. But then humanity, especially the nations, shifted to a 365-day calendar. They added and altered based on the sun, agriculture, and practicality. At that point, the sacred rhythm began to slip. Offerings were made on the wrong days. Holy festivals were forgotten. The Sabbath fell out of alignment, and people believed they were still living faithfully, but in truth, they had fallen out of rhythm. According to Jubilees, it is this very dissonance that caused humanity to gradually lose the covenant. Not because they consciously rejected God, but because they no longer lived in the cycle He had established. They did not believe wrong. They lived off-season. This is a chilling warning. Because the most frightening thing is not that you don't believe in God, but that you still believe, yet live out of sync with the sacred rhythm. You still keep the faith, but follow a calendar no longer connected to the light of the fourth day. You still pray, but on days that no longer open the gates in their appointed times. You still seek to meet God, but stand before a closed gate, not because He has withdrawn, but because you came in the wrong season. Jubilees does not condemn, it awakens. It does not demand that you change your religion, but invites you to hear again the sacred rhythm that once resounded in Eden, in the offering of Enoch, in the appointed times of Noah, in the timely obedience of Abraham. If you've ever felt your faith grow dry, even as you still keep the rituals, if you've sensed something out of sync in your spirit, it may be because you are living out of rhythm. And when a life drifts out of sacred rhythm, the covenant, though not destroyed, will no longer flow through us like living water. We are not rejected, but we have stepped out of the stream. Therefore, what we must seek is not something newer or more dazzling, but something truer. Not to change our faith, but to adjust our rhythm. Not to rebuild the structure, but to return to the original cycle of light, of appointed seasons, of the sacred calendar that first rang out at creation. For when we are in rhythm, we not only return to God, we return to ourselves. Not all angels fell, not all humans were lost. While most of the watchers, the angels sent to watch over humanity, abandoned their posts, drawn by beauty and desire, there were still those who did not betray. Uriel still fulfilled his mission, warning Noah of the coming flood. Raphael still acted, binding Azazel and halting the spread of corrupted knowledge. Michael still stood, guarding Abraham and the chosen lineage. They did not perform dazzling wonders like in fairy tales, but they did not leave their posts. They preserved the covenant by staying in their roles. And among a humanity unraveling from the fall, there were still those who lived in rhythm. Adam kept the Sabbath in Eden. Seth continued. Enoch called upon the name of the Lord. Enoch recorded the sacred calendar. Noah offered sacrifices in due season. Abraham, as affirmed in the Book of Jubilees, kept all commandments and ordinances even before the law was given on Mount Sinai. These people did not live by religion, they lived by rhythm. They were not defined by titles, but carried within them the cycle of light. As long as angels still kept watch, there were still people walking in the appointed times and seasons. Jubilees paints two parallel but harmonious streams, faithful angels and rhythm-keeping humans. One held their post in the spiritual realm, the other kept the cycle in daily life. One never abandoned position, the other never missed a season. And between the two, the covenant was never severed, even as human history filled with falls, misdirection, and forgetfulness. If the covenant is a sacred symphony, then these are the notes still ringing true. They do not need a conductor. They carry the rhythm within. We often think of the covenant as a contract, but in Jubilees, the covenant is a symphony. And that symphony doesn't depend on the masses, nor on grand churches or complex doctrines. It needs only a few, just a few, who remember the rhythm, who keep the rhythm, who live the rhythm. For without harmony, the music disappears into silence. But if even one person, just one, keeps the sacred rhythm, then the covenant still resounds, softly perhaps, from afar perhaps, but never extinguished. So the question is not only who has fallen, but also who still keeps the rhythm. If the watchers were lured by what sparkled, there were still angels who chose to remain in silence. If humanity followed the calendar of empires, there were still those who lived by the sacred seasons. And if today we feel the world in chaos, our faith exhausted, it may not be that God has departed, but that no one has remembered the rhythm for too long. But that sacred melody has never vanished. It's simply waiting for someone to hear again. We have heard so much about the angels who fell, the watchers who abandoned their posts, shared forbidden knowledge, mated with humanity, and birthed the Nephilim. They are the haunting protagonists of stories, symbols of betrayal and supernatural consequence. But what of the angels who did not abandon their place? What of those who stood still, who did not trade their divine calling for desire? What did they do? Where did they go? What did they quietly preserve? The Book of Jubilees assures us they did not disappear. Uriel was still sent to warn Noah, not with thunder, but with a word about the coming time. Michael still fought for the righteous lineage, not just on visible battlefields, but in the invisible balance between order and chaos. Raphael still bound the adversaries, not with physical chains, but through the power to distinguish light from deception. They didn't need to be known, didn't need to be named in public prayers. But it is their silent faithfulness that marks the thin line between survival and destruction. Modern theology often speaks of two realms, God and man, heaven and hell. But Jubilees reveals a third, the realm of angels who never fell, who never boasted, who never vied for power, but simply held their post. They are soldiers without victory songs, sentinels without applause. But without them, Noah would not have been saved. Abraham would not have been protected, and the covenant would have ceased to pass on. Perhaps they were too quiet, and so forgotten by later generations. Perhaps they were too humble, and so never taught. But if we look again, it is their steady presence in a decaying world that proves the light never went out. We just looked the wrong way. The story of the Watchers, if it ends only in the fall, is only half the story. The other half is of those who did not fall. And that brings us to a profound question. If in the world of angels, where falling is possible, there are those who remain faithful, then in the world of humans, can we choose to keep our place? If those angels did not abandon their vocation, did not seek praise, did not need recognition, yet intervened whenever the covenant was threatened, then what stops us from becoming rhythm keepers in our own chaotic time? Perhaps the untold story is of those who stood when all others knelt. The angels who never fell are still working, not under spotlights, but in shadows, among disrupted cycles, among souls who have forgotten the beat. And because of them, the covenant still clings to this world. Everyone knows that Noah was chosen by God to build the Ark of Salvation. But the Book of Jubilees reveals a deeper detail. Before Noah laid the first plank, he was taught how to observe the sacred festivals. He knew when to offer sacrifices, how to distinguish between pure and impure seasons, when to be silent and when to act. The ark could save the body, but the sacred rhythm saved the soul. And if he had not lived in sync, would he have heard the call from above as the flood drew near? Abraham too was not saved by abstract belief. He built altars at precise locations at appointed times. He did not wait for stone tablets from Sinai to begin keeping the law. He lived in a world with no religion, no congregation, but he heard the melody of the sacred calendar and lived in step with it. For him, the covenant was not something written, it was a rhythm beneath time. Enoch, the one taken by God because he pleased him, is also described in Jubilees as the first to record the cycles of seasons, years and festivals. Before Israel, before Moses, there was a man who remembered the timing of God. He did not need to perform miracles. He only needed to live without falling out of rhythm. And it was that perfect harmony with the sacred beat that spared him from death. What did all these people have in common? They didn't preach the covenant. They didn't loudly proclaim religion. They didn't require magnificent temples. They simply lived in the right season, offered in the right time, listened in the right hour, And through that silent synchronization, they kept the melody of the covenant unbroken. In a world where solar and lunar calendars are mixed, where seasons are governed by markets and time is defined by busyness, living in sacred rhythm feels profoundly unfamiliar. And for that very reason, those who still keep the true cycle become signs, not loud ones, like a quiet lamp in the night, not banishing the darkness, but guiding the lost. For true light doesn't need to dazzle, it only needs to shine at the right moment. And maybe that is why Noah was chosen. Abraham was promised. Enoch was taken, not because they were perfect, but because they remembered the rhythm. In a world full of chaos and dissonance, those who live by the season become the pivot, preserving a fragment of stability for all. They are the echo of Eden's rhythm, the whisper that light still remains, if only we look to where it rises. In the modern world, calendar is understood as a tool to manage time. Boxes on a page, alerts on a phone, deadlines to meet. But in the Book of Jubilees, the calendar is not administrative. It is a frequency system. It is an invisible rhythm that connects humanity with heaven, the cycle of light and darkness, of sowing and reaping, of festivals and stillness. The sacred calendar does not begin with man. It begins on the fourth day of creation, when God made the sun, moon, and stars, the celestial instruments of rhythm. When the watchers fell, they did not merely sin with their bodies. They abandoned their positions, that is, they stepped outside their appointed cycles. They interfered with things not meant for their time. They taught mankind knowledge ahead of its season, turning time into chaos. And when humanity learned such things, they did not just fall morally, they fell out of the sacred frequency. They began to eat out of season, offer sacrifices out of time, unite at the wrong moment. And the consequence was not just loss of guidance, but loss of connection. Jubilees emphasizes that the sacred year has 364 days, not because the number is convenient, but because it forms 52 perfect weeks, each season having 91 days, each quarter with a balanced structure. In that rhythm, the one who knows the season knows the offering. The one who knows the day knows gratitude. The one who knows the week knows how to wait. It is invisible education, a frequency through time. And one who keeps the rhythm does not need to memorize every law. Living in sync is itself keeping the covenant. But when the calendar is changed, not by divine will, but by politics, war, conquest, the covenant begins to withdraw from daily life. People still worship, but not on the right days. Still offer sacrifices, but not in the right seasons. Still remember God, but can no longer hear the melody from heaven. And the most painful part is this: people believe they are still living faithfully, but in truth, they are just slightly off-beat. Then 2 beats, then gradually, entirely out of tune. If the covenant were merely a contract, you could forget it and sign again. But if the covenant is a piece of music, you cannot casually change its rhythm, its key, or its tempo. This song has rests, crescendos, offerings, and silences. And the one who keeps the covenant is not the one who memorizes the law, but the one who still remembers how to sing in harmony. They listen. They wait for the right moment. They don't interrupt the flow. They don't insert foreign melodies. They sing with heaven, not over it. And perhaps they are the ones who still hold the light, In a world disordered by fast clocks and misaligned spiritual rhythms. If you feel out of place in today's pace, it may not be because you're weak, but because you're still tuned to a different song. And that is a sign that you're still catching the frequency of a covenant that has never gone silent. When we think of Enoch, our minds often fill with images of fallen angels, the watchers seduced by earthly beauty, the Nephilim sowing chaos, and a world sinking into darkness, violence, and blood. It's a gripping, dramatic story, one filled with warning. But if we stop there, if we see only the fall, we miss a no less crucial part, the light that remains. The Book of Jubilees, hidden from most of the mainstream biblical tradition, does not deny the fall. But it tells what Enoch does not emphasize, that there were still angels who held their place. Uriel still went forth at God's command to warn Noah. Raphael still executed judgment against Azazel. Michael still guarded Abraham, not with a sword, but with silent, sacred presence. They did not fall. They did not betray. They were simply not mentioned in a narrative too focused on the negative. The problem is not Enoch. The problem lies in how we receive it. We are drawn to the drama of downfall, to the long descent and the catastrophic consequences. We're fascinated by rebellion, disruption, the abnormal. But in the silence of the faithful angels, in the stillness of the covenant keepers, there is a sacred strength that quietly sustains order. And that may be the very reason why the world did not entirely collapse. Not all angels fell, not all humans missed the rhythm, not every lamp was extinguished. A few still burned, not brightly, not blindingly, but steadily, unmoved from their station. The question is, amidst the screams of chaos, who is still quiet enough to notice the light? The Book of Jubilees does not tell a simple black and white confrontation. It reveals a world where light and darkness coexist, where fall and faithfulness happen side by side, where the sacred does not always thunder, but often speaks in a whisper. And if we only pay attention to what is loud, we will miss the true voice of the covenant. The fall is not the whole story. It's only one chapter. The real question is, who still stands when everything around them falls? And you, who are you watching? Those who fell or those who remain? An angel who holds their post is not merely a figure of loyalty, but a living symbol that the covenant still exists. For if there were no law, no command, what would the angel be guarding? The fact that Uriel still warns, Michael still protects, and Raphael still enforces is not just faithfulness in action, but proof that divine order is still being upheld. And if the angels still keep the law, then that law was never undone. Jubilees presents a vision completely opposite to modern thought about the law. It is not a dry list of commandments, but a living rhythm passed from Adam to Abraham. Adam kept the Sabbath. Enoch gave offerings at the appointed times. Noah knew which days required preparation. Abraham lived in season, offered in season, and not out of fear of punishment, but because he could still hear the original rhythm. That rhythm didn't begin at Sinai, it began in Eden and has never stopped. If today's world says the law has passed, they're assuming the law began at Sinai. But Jubilees turns that assumption on its head. Sinai was not the beginning, it was the re-establishment. The covenant didn't start with Israel, but with their forefathers. And those forefathers didn't learn the law from Moses, but directly from God through angels. The law, at its deepest meaning, is not legal code, but the frequency of life. To live in rhythm is to keep the law. To fall out of rhythm is to break the covenant. The question isn't, is the law still valid? The question is, can we still hear its frequency? Because if Abraham could live among pagans and still keep the law, if Enoch could live before the flood and remain in sync, if Noah could stand in an age of violence and still be called righteous, then perhaps the law never disappeared. It's just buried beneath the wrong calendars, the wrong seasons, and a lifestyle that no longer knows how to wait for sacred time. So why are we so quick to declare that the law is gone? Is it because it's inconvenient? Because it no longer fits modern rhythm? Or because we've lost the ability to listen and called that freedom? But if an angel still holds position, and if an ancient man still kept rhythm, then perhaps the truth still exists, waiting to be remembered. And when we remember, the covenant doesn't need to be re-established. It only needs to be lived again. The Book of Enoch overwhelms us with visions of the fall, powerful angels abandoning their posts, making pacts with the daughters of men, and birthing Nephilim, giants who brought calamity upon the earth. Enoch witnesses all of this. He ascends through the heavens, hears the weeping of the watchers in chains, and records a divine indictment of an unprecedented celestial rebellion. But if that is where we stop, we only see one side of reality, the side that broke. And for that reason, we must revisit Enoch through the lens of Jubilees. In Jubilees, Enoch is not primarily emphasized as a recorder of the fall, but as a man in harmony with the covenant. He is one who kept the appointed feasts, who lived in the divine cycles, who was taken from the earth because he lived without missing a beat. Not because he exposed what was wrong, but because he lived rightly in a time gone wrong. He was not just a witness to sin, but an icon of faithfulness. This redefines our view of Enoch, from prophet of chaos to harmonizer with creation's song. Placed side by side, Enoch and Jubilees, there is no contradiction, but a sacred symmetry. Enoch looks down into the abyss, where light was twisted into darkness. Jubilees looks toward those who remained, where light retained its original frequency. One narrates betrayal, the other affirms loyalty. One sketches the battle, the other keeps the rhythm. And in between them stands Enoch, the one who walked through both light and shadow, who witnessed the fall but was not swept away, who stood at the fault line and kept balance. The truth, perhaps, is not found in one book alone, but in the willingness to place both together. To admit that in the spiritual realm, there is no absolute monochrome. Angels can fall, but angels also stand. Humans can break rhythm, but some still keep the feasts. Betrayal is real, but so is faithfulness. Just as shadows only exist where light meets form, sacred truth only emerges when we dare to embrace both fall and faithfulness. And Enoch, not only as the chronicler of collapse, but as the last to remember the original song of the covenant, who remembered how to live, how to walk, how to offer, how to keep rhythm. Perhaps that is why he did not die, but was taken to a place where still someone remembers the law, waiting for the day the world remembers how to begin again. If the watchers fell, if the guardian angels betrayed, if the heavens were shattered under the weight of lust and pride, Then what kept Noah afloat when the world sank into destruction? Who warned him? Who showed him how to build the ark? Who taught him about the offering cycles? If all angels had fallen, who did God send to speak the warning? And if everything was lost, why did a righteous lineage still survive? Why did the covenant continue from Noah to Shem, then to Abraham? And if every manuscript was edited, erased, or destroyed during the shaping of the official Bible, then why, in a land far from the center of religious power like Ethiopia, does the Book of Jubilees still exist? An original melody written in ancient memory, still intact, though removed from official lists. Perhaps light never vanished. It simply shifted away from the center, like a flame blown into a corner, unnoticed but never extinguished. And that light doesn't need to be reinvented, it only needs to be seen. Jubilees gives us a map, not just of time, but of frequency. It does not force us to return to the past, but invites us to restore a rhythm our souls once knew. A cycle of feasts, a way of living in season, a sense that time is not a straight line, but a concentric spiral between heaven and humanity. When we live out of season, we do not merely stray from tradition, we stray from life itself. But if we reset the cycle, if we remember the true beginning, we may begin to see again the sparks long hidden. And each spark is a sacred memory awaiting restoration. Not to return to the past out of nostalgia, but to remember there was once a frequency that aligned the universe, and mankind once lived in tune with it. The covenant, then, was not a legal contract. It was an inner calling, the heartbeat of a soul that still remembers creation's rhythm. And not all have forgotten. There are still those who offer at the appointed times. There are still those who keep Sabbath, not out of law, but out of rhythm. There are still angels who hold their post, not out of dominance, but out of faithfulness. The light has never gone out. It only waits for someone to turn back and quietly live in the original rhythm. You may never hear their names in Sunday sermons. They may not be sung in hymns or painted on stained glass, but they are there, the angels who never left their post. When Uriel came to Noah, there was no trumpet, no thunder, only a quiet word, a warning, a gentle instruction about the ark and the flood to come. When Raphael bound Azazel, there was no dazzling light, only silent justice executed in a cracking world. When Michael shielded Abraham, it was not a Revelation-style battle, but a quiet defense of a bloodline destined to become a people. These angels do not need to be celebrated. They do not need to stand on mountaintops with flaming swords. They only need to remain. When others give up, they stay. When the cosmos cracks, they preserve the root, not by might, but by faithfulness, not with noise, but with steady stillness. And in every chaotic age, there are always such ones. Gatekeepers when the walls collapse, path holders when all direction is lost, frequency keepers when the sacred song is distorted. You may never find them in common texts, but they are recorded in Jubilees, the book modernity cast out, but Ethiopia preserved as sacred inheritance, because that book still remembers the angels who did not fall, still remembers the ones who never missed the beat. Without them, Noah would be gone. Abraham would not have endured. The righteous line would not have continued. The covenant did not vanish with a roar. It slipped out of the stream of official history and flowed into the still places where the silent ones still kept the flame. You may never have spoken their names, but because of them, the light still passes through generations. Because of them, there is still a sacred rhythm to which humanity can return. And if today you feel something stir deep in your soul, like a faint, familiar call, perhaps it is because someone, somewhere, still hasn't left their post. The Book of Jubilees is not found in standard Bibles. You won't see it in the table of contents of the KJV or in the curricula of major denominations. To many, the name itself is unfamiliar. But in Ethiopia, a land untouched by colonial rewriting, where many forgotten sacred traditions still live, the Book of Jubilees survives. Not as an artifact, but as a rhythm, copied by hand for centuries, read at appointed festivals, preserved not for history, but for life. And that invites the question, what is it about this book that a whole civilization chose to preserve while the rest of the world discarded it? Perhaps because it is not simply a text, but a song, a sacred song, where each season of the year is not merely weather, but the cycle of the soul, where angels are not symbols, but levels of cosmic order, where law is not regulation, but a current of life that never ceases, only forgotten in the busy clockwork of the modern age. While our calendar tracks 365 days, divided by fiscal quarters, vacation slots, and administrative milestones, the calendar of Jubilees still marks the beat of offerings, Sabbaths, fasts, and deep restoration. When we live in haste, we live out of rhythm. When we chase after seasons, sales targets, and deadlines, our souls begin to drift from their intended orbit. And when the inner turmoil no longer has a name, Jubilees gently whispers to us, there is another season where the sacred still waits to be restored. That season is not found in Google Calendar, but in the memory of the soul. It is the sacred time Adam once lived in, 7 years in Eden, aligned in cycle, before a single step off beat led to his exile from the garden. Jubilees does not need to appear on every bookshelf to be of value. It lives quietly, like a melody erased from the modern score, but still echoing in the souls of those silent enough to hear. The world may no longer call its name, but that very forgetfulness is the proof. What has been pushed away from the center may be the very thing keeping the center from falling apart. And if you're searching for a place to return to, you may not need a new philosophy. You may just need an old rhythm where time and soul once sang the same song. Not everyone remains to the end of a story like this. Today's world is flooded with short clips, brief headlines, a culture of rapid consumption where sacred things are often deemed outdated. But if you are still here, patient, quiet, present, then perhaps you're not just curious. Perhaps you are remembering. Perhaps you carry a sacred frequency inside you. A faint echo from a distant past you cannot name but have always felt. Maybe you've known what it's like to live out of season, not just in terms of weather, but something much deeper. Disconnected from an invisible cycle that once aligned your faith, your rituals, your prayers, now dulled by the noise of a rushing life. You haven't abandoned faith, but it feels as if the covenant has stepped away from you, or you from it, even by just half a step. And now, today, through these forbidden pages, forgotten angels, and seemingly lost rhythms, you've heard an ancient song again. If that is true, this is no longer a question of belief. This is a question of rhythm, of whether you're ready to realign, not to adopt a new religion, but to live the rhythm you were made to live. Are you willing to keep the covenant, not with words, but with each breath, each sacred season, each small, quiet act? You don't have to be a prophet. You don't need to preach. You don't have to prove anything. But if you begin to live in season again, keeping the rhythms of the sacred year, you are keeping the covenant alive. You don't need to show you're chosen. Your way of living will be the evidence. Because light doesn't need sound to shine, and the covenant doesn't need declarations to exist. It only needs someone who remembers, who keeps, who lives in rhythm. And maybe that someone is you. If you feel something resonating inside, a vibration not loud but steady, then don't let it pass in silence. Leave a testimony, not just a polite thank you, but a marker. A note that shows where memory began to wake. A moment that made you pause, made you stop scrolling. A question you couldn't ignore. A memory you once felt, but never dared to name. It might be a passing thought, a backward glance, a strange sense that you've known this before, somewhere in a deeper part of your soul. Because if memory awakens in one person, it will begin to spread to another. If one records, it will be read. If one remembers, then the covenant has never truly disappeared. The sacred does not need millions of followers to survive. It needs only one person who hasn't forgotten, one who still lives in rhythm, one who dares to preserve what was discarded, not to rebel, but to restore. Share in the comments. What part of this journey made you pause? What sentence stirred you? What image reminded you that you're not alone? Don't hesitate to write it down. Even a single sentence, a single line, is enough to rejoin the thread of remembrance, because sometimes even the smallest testimony can be the key for someone else to rediscover what is sacred and lost. There are stories that never end. They do not need a conclusion because they are still being lived through each person, each action, each life that finds its way back to the cycle. If today's story truly awakened something in you, then it has already continued. And the final question is not, what did the story say, but how will you live it? Because light does not spread through words, but through memory revived in lived life. And if you're still here, then maybe you are the one who will retell it, not through speech, but through your way of living. Amen.